Yuji is back and there is blood everywhere. However, fortunately, it's blood he's controlling. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, Chapter 19 of Modulo has officially leaked. And while this chapter mostly focuses on the battle between Dober and Mahoraga, with Dober figuring out how to travel at sub-light speeds and delivering some of the hardest hitting punches and kicks we've ever seen, somehow the reveal of quite possibly the strongest character in JJK history in Dober with his light speed movement is overshadowed by the fact the main character of JJK is back. And this time, for real. Not just as somebody who's being talked about, not just as a shadowy figure off in the corner of a train station. No, Yuji is back, not only delivering lines, but also ensuring that humans and Sumerians don't kick off a battle they aren't ready to finish. And thus, while we always knew that at some point Yuji was gonna make his heroic return to Modulo's pages, I honestly didn't think it was going to be this soon. All that is to say that Chapter 19 of Modulo is absolutely stuffed to the gills with action, and I cannot wait to get into that action with you. So with no further ado, let's head directly into Chapter 19 of Modulo Reviewed. But before we get to reviewing anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're still training, I'm sorry. But before we get started with the video, everyone say hi to the inside of a airport hotel room in Sapporo. Vacation doesn't matter with some of the greatest modern day shonen manga, well, refuses to stop dropping. But look, I got a Naruto art book at the Shonen Jump store today, so, you know, I'm doing some vacationing. On to the chapter. Chapter 19 picks up basically directly where Chapter 18 left off. That is to say that we don't step away from the fight between Dober and Mahoraga, which ended off Chapter 18. See, for those of you who don't remember, my God, get your brain checked. It was like a week ago. It's at this point that we would put the week ago music in, except it's trademarked, and I like the money I make from this channel. But anyways, Chapter 18 ended off with Dober coming to the realization that Mahoraga had adapted to his light-based attacks, and therefore his light-based attacks, which he had used to win every fight he'd ever been involved in up until this moment, were completely useless. However, after doing some reflection on his childhood and his connection to Dura, the former chieftain of the Loomer tribe, who he had to kill in combat because the Diskunte wanted to take the Loomer tribesman's land, Dober came to the realization that while the entire world believes him to be a warrior, he actually hasn't become a warrior yet. Because fighting, even though you don't want to fight, or not fighting because you don't want to fight, aren't the kind of things that make you a warrior. The kind of things that make you a warrior, fighting because you need to. And thus, upon making that realization, Dober realized this battle against Mahoraga was truly his first ever real battle. And in this first ever real battle, Dober came to the conclusion that he needed to try for his first ever time. And thus, instead of trying to implement his light-based attacks as projectiles like he had done prior, Dober instead decided to do something that he hadn't done previously with his light-based attack on account of the fact that it was bad for his body, which was accelerating his body to close the speed of light to increase the force of his punches and his kicks. And thus, Chapter 18 ends with Dober coming to the realization that he needs to accelerate his body to its absolute maximum and beat Mahoraga to death. And thus, Chapter 19 opens with Dober trying to do, well, exactly that. See, the chapter opens with a bewildered Mahoraga standing in the center of the abandoned Tokyo, looking around trying to find Dober, who's doing his best impersonation of the Flash, speeding around Mahoraga at a speed that is rapidly approaching light speed. In an absolutely gorgeous double spread, we see Dober with light beams flying all around him, running at what appears to be close to light speed. Now, we can tell that Dober is approaching light speeds because there's no longer just one Mahoraga. See, as Dober approaches relativistic speeds, we see multiple different copies of Mahoraga all around Dober. And the reason that there's multiple copies of Mahoraga is because at the speed of light, Dober no longer perceives time linearly, being able to see the past, future, and present all simultaneously. And thus, anything that Mahoraga did, is going to do, or is currently doing while Dober is moving close to the speed of light are all things that Dober would be privy to. On top of this, we also see that the sheer force of Dober accelerating to the speed of light is devastating the landscape around this battle, cutting down entire city blocks as Dober runs past them. And this ties into the thing that we talked about last week, that an object with mass moving at the speed of light technically has infinite mass. And while Dober isn't necessarily moving at the speed of light, the faster he moves, the heavier he gets. Not the heavy, the more massive he gets. But because he is an object with quantifiable mass moving at close to the speed of light, he would generate a ridiculous amount of kinetic energy, and he would warp space-time, causing a ridiculous amount of damage to his surroundings, like he's doing. And yet still, he's pushing his body to try to achieve the speed of light. However, once he reaches the location of Mahoraga, he spins his body and begins to launch a kick. But as he launches this kick, we see his foot push back against the air of the atmosphere. See, Newton's third law of thermodynamics states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and therefore the action of Dobera pressing up on those oxygen molecules at the speed of light with almost infinite mass would apply a ridiculous amount of pressure back on his leg. And we see him struggling with this as he thinks to himself, it's so hot and heavy, his leg that is. But still, Dobera perseveres, as the narrator tells us that as you approach the speed of light, the air in the atmosphere functions less like a gas and more like a solid. And yet Dobera pushes through, thinking about Dura and how Dura always told him to catch up. And on the next page, we see Mahoraga's face, the place that Dobera is launching his kick to. And in a moment of the calm before the storm, we see the desolate, abandoned landscape of Tokyo, and just one sound effect that says, glim, as the entire landscape, entire city blocks are turned into molten lava with just this one kick. A level of destruction we have not seen since Sukuna's thermobaric explosion using his domain expansion at the end of JJK. I mean, everything surrounding this kick is evaporated, turned into dust like that. And wow, that is also basically exactly what happens with Sukuna's thermobaric explosion. It seems as though the scale of this explosion is substantially larger, though it is hard to say. And Dobera, after throwing this near light speed kick, bounces backwards, most likely because of the force that it took to throw this kick in the first place, stops his momentum and looks up to where Mahoraga should be. But as he looks up, we see him shocked. See, because while Dobera did just hit Mahoraga with what is undoubtedly one of the strongest attacks we've ever seen in JJK, still a singular little speck of Mahoraga exists, no larger than a finger. But yet still some of Mahoraga exists, and thus so long as just a little bit of Mahoraga continues to exist, so does his eight-handled wheel. And thus, even though Dobera just hit Mahoraga square in the face with what could be the strongest offensive move we've ever seen in the JJK universe, it wasn't enough, which gives credence to the idea that this is the strongest version of Mahoraga we've ever seen. I mean, after all, we've seen Mahoraga defeated with just one of Sukuna's Fuga arrows. And mind you, that was in a full power Sukuna. That was Sukuna still in Yuji, which means it was just 15-finger Sukuna. Now, you could say that this proves that 15-finger Sukuna is stronger than even this iteration of Dobera that's pushing his body to the limits, but I think it more gives credence to the idea that this is the strongest version of Mahoraga we've ever seen. A version of Mahoraga made stronger by all of the high-level fights it had against people like Gojo and Sukuna. And as Mahoraga is known to adapt, and it's never explicitly stated that a new version of Mahoraga is summoned for every 10 Shadows user, and I don't think it's unrealistic to say that the iteration of Mahoraga that Dobera is fighting against right now was an iteration of Mahoraga made stronger by all of its previous experience. And as Dobera watches on as this mere sliver of Mahoraga begins to adapt to his light speed movement, he thinks to himself that Mahoraga most likely adapts much faster to straightforward combat than it does to complex techniques like light-based projectiles, and therefore the window that Dobera has to use light speed-based kicks or punches to destroy Mahoraga before he adapts to them is much smaller than the window that Dobera had to use light-based projectiles to kill Mahoraga. And mind you, Dobera wasn't able to kill Mahoraga with light-based projectile, and thus Dobera sighs as he says, "What a pain." But then a smile begins to creep on the edges of his lips as he thinks to himself, but at the same time, for the first time ever, I think I'm enjoying fighting. As he raises his blood-stained, sharpened claws at the first real opponent he's ever had. We then get a really cool page where Dobera thinks to himself as him and Mahoraga dance around the entire page, I want to keep fighting. I want to hone my skills to awaken a version of myself that I never dreamed possible. However, before Dobera can either dive into more combat or more dancing with Mahoraga, on the next page it's revealed that the leg that Dobera used to launch his light speed kick is, while completely destroyed. It's ashen smithereens, which makes sense because, like I said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And as Dober looks down at this burnt stump of a leg, he thinks to himself that it'll only get in the way, and therefore he should just cut it off. But before he pulls an Isaac Netero and rips off his own leg, he thinks to himself about how sorcerers from Earth claim to be able to heal people with their cursed energy. Because after all, after Cross was shot, human sorcerers offered to try to save his life. But that concept doesn't make any sense to Dober. How could you heal with what is inherently negative energy? But then Dober starts thinking to himself that he feels a different kind of energy radiating from Maharaga's blade, his sword of extermination. And it's at this point that I'd like to remind all of you that Maharaga's sword of extermination is imbued with positive energy that Maharaga uses to kill cursed spirits, because cursed spirits are made out of negative energy. And thus Maharaga, who most likely believes that Dober is a cursed spirit, had been attacking Dober and attacking Dober's cursed technique with positive energy on his sword of extermination. And therefore, in order to show Maharaga that it's not the only thing that knows how to adapt, Dober pulls a page out of Gojo's book and thinks to himself about how you could possibly convert negative energy into positive energy. And in that moment exactly, his leg begins to regrow, retaking its original shape, much to Dober's surprise, as he looks down at his newly fixed leg and says, "I see. Earth's cursed energy is quite advanced." We then cut away from the fight for just a second as we see all of Japan's sorcerers meeting in some kind of jujitsu governmental hearing. A jujitsu governmental hearing being led by Bun's girl whose name I forgot. But 1010 is letting humanity's fighting force know that if Dober begins fighting against Yuka in the abandoned zone that is Tokyo, then there's a high likelihood that tons of low-level cursed spirits will scatter out of the abandoned zone as they run for their lives after feeling the ridiculous power of both Dober and Yuka/Maharaga. However, 1010, whose name at this point I refuse to look back up, goes on to say that it'll really only be cursed spirits of grade 2 or lower, as cursed spirits of grade 2 or higher most likely won't run after feeling the cursed energy of this fight. And therefore, it's not necessarily a problem of quality, but quantity, because there are still a ridiculous amount of low-level cursed spirits in the abandoned zone of Tokyo. One, because all of the cursed spirits of Japan are centralized to this area, and two, because regularly scheduled exterminations haven't been able to happen because the Sumerians believe that the cursed spirits are their, oh god, what do they call them? Galyons. I had to look it up. But because this, the abandoned zone of Tokyo is filled with more cursed spirits than usual, and thus all of the sorcerers of Japan are being brought together to ensure that these low-level cursed spirits aren't able to escape the containment zone that is Tokyo. And thus all of the people who live around the contamination zone in a 10-kilometer radius have been evacuated, and the barrier around Tokyo has been augmented to try and drive the cursed spirits towards the ocean as much as possible. We then cut to the Sumerian warriors, who are having a similar conversation, where the long-haired Sumerian warrior, who's usually at the center of all of the problems revolving around the Loomer tribe, you know, the one who tried to attune himself to the voice of the cursed spirits and heard all the ones that were being exterminated by the sorcerers in secret, whose name I also refuse to look up. Well, he's talking to his gaggle of other unnamed warriors, telling them that there's no way to ensure that humanity is going to respect the rules of the Diskunte duel, and therefore it is their job to ensure that nobody interferes with the battle between Yuka and Dober. And while I'm just going to call him Kurt Cobain doesn't believe that humanity's sorcerers would be able to interfere with this fight even if they wanted to, he tells his gaggle of warriors that if they come across any humans in what is now revealed to be Tokyo, they're down in Tokyo as well, that they should either apprehend them or just kill them, because after all, they're the ones who started this fight in the first place. However, Kurt Cobain's gaggle of warriors believe killing the humans that they possibly stumble upon is going too far. But Kurt Cobain, he doesn't. He's radicalized. However, rather unfortunately for everyone involved, while the Sumerians are having this very loud argument, it's revealed that a bunch of Japanese sorcerers have also already made their way into Tokyo. And they're yelling at each other about peeing, specifically about peeing in a building, because there's no running water in Tokyo anymore. And thus at the exact same time, both the Sumerians and the Earthlings become aware of each other's presence, and both parties ready their weapons. But before we can see who's stronger, humanity or the Sumerians, we smash cut to outside this very building, where we see the mysterious hooded figure that we've seen multiple times over the course of Modulo up until this chapter, saying aloud, "Good grief, I knew this was gonna happen." Not that I said anything, though. And that mysterious hooded figure who's got a scar on his lip exactly like the former MC of JJK, Yuji Itadori, is holding a converged ball of blood. So like obviously it's Yuji. It's been confirmed multiple times that this character is Yuji. And all the sorcerers in Japan have been trying to find Yuji because apparently Yuji is immortal because of his ridiculous amount of cursed energy, his ridiculously powerful body, and the fact that he is half cursed spirit because he is a death womb painting. However, because Yuji is a death womb painting and therefore technically a descendant of the Kamo clan through Noritoshi Kamo, who was Kenjaku, Yuji for a large majority of JJK had some semblance of blood manipulation. However, Yuji was never particularly all that good at blood manipulation because apparently Chozo was a bad teacher, and the second Noritoshi Kamo, yes, there's a second Noritoshi Kamo. As to why he got the name Noritoshi, I will never know, was only around long enough to teach him the absolute basics before he went to fight against Sukuna. And therefore, even in Yuji's battle against Sukuna at the end of JJK, in order to use convergence, which allows for a blood manipulation user to condense their blood to its absolute max, which allows them to fire out their blood in either a blood arrow, a blood laser, really whatever they want, Yuji had to use a tool. However, what's being displayed by Yuji right now is just regular old convergence, no tool necessary, which, you know, makes sense when you consider the fact that Yuji's like now 90 years old and has been fighting cursed spirits his entire life. But anyways, the takeaway from all of this is that Yuji is now a high-level blood manipulation user, most likely on the same level, if not better than people like Chozo. We then cut away from Yuji for a second as we see Mino, whose name I do remember because he's like kind of a main character, as he's watching Yuji clamp his hands together. But because Mino believes that Yuji is just a civilian hanging out in the abandoned zone of Tokyo, he begins to run over to him saying, "Hey, you can't be here." But before Mino's able to do anything, not that he could do anything, Yuji simply utters, "Piercing blood." At which point a proverbial barrage of blood floods through the windows on the level that the Cimmerians and Earthlings are standing on and strikes down non-lethally, of course, both the Cimmerians and the Earthlings, as they all reel in surprise, taken aback by this convergence piercing blood attack. We then cut back to the outside of the building as we see blood firing out of every single glass window in this gigantic office building, as Yuji says aloud in a very Yuji-esque way, "Was that too much?" while clapping his hands. All the while, Mino reveals to us, the readers, and himself, something that we all already knew, that it's Yuji, and thus Yuji has re-entered the fold. And like, there's a lot to take away from this sequence. One, there was the fact that Yuji was able to use a Chozo-esque amount of blood in this piercing blood attack, which reveals that he's truly leveraged his lineage as a death womb painting, which allows him to use way more blood than any human would ever be able to use, because as a person who is part cursed spirit, his body is so overfilled with cursed energy that he can constantly use reverse cursed energy on himself, something that we know he can do because of his battle against Sukuna, to refill the blood in his body that he is pumping away to use convergence. And like, while filling an entire office building with his own blood isn't the most impressive blood manipulation feat we've ever seen. I mean, very recently in JJK Season 3, we just watched Chozo fill an entire subway tunnel. It is by far and away the most impressive blood manipulation feat we've ever seen from Yuji. And while obviously Yuji, who is now the strongest sorcerer in all of Japan, was always gonna get stronger with time, him adding in Chozo level blood manipulation to his bag is kind of a crazy upscale. But now the question needs to be asked, what is Yuji going to do now that he's been reintroduced into the story? Is he going to enter into the battle against Dober, or is he going to fight against Maru? Or will he simply act as a pacifist, ensuring that humanity and the Cimmerians don't engage in any further combat? Well, I can't say right now, but I can say in the next video coming out on this channel. So while you're telling me about how much you loved this chapter, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the noti bell. Because while I understand I've been dedicating a vast majority of my runtime on this channel recently to Modulo, somebody's gotta do it. Excuse me, it's 11:30 and I'm in a hotel, probably keeping up all of my neighbors. So I'm gonna go to bed now.